Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment as we're waiting for participants to join. For those just joining, we're just going to give it a moment to allow other participants to join in this morning. Just going to give it one more minute to allow our participants to join, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we'll get started this morning and others will join in as we get moving. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm the Vice President of the Stimson Center, as well as the Director of our Conventional Defense Program, which seeks to reduce the risk and minimize harm associated with the global arms trade. I am so pleased to welcome everyone to this event today to discuss some exciting and I think incredibly relevant new research that goes to the heart of some of the assumptions that underpin thinking around U.S. arms transfers. Now, for anyone in our audience that's worked on any issues related to U.S. arms sales, and especially those that have advocated for greater restraint, responsibility, and oversight, you no doubt will have come across the common phrase, if we don't sell them, someone else will. There's a lot baked into that very short phrase. With just 9 words, the axiom encapsulates really deep-seated concerns that efforts to curtail or condition U.S. arms transfers will lead countries to simply look elsewhere for their defense needs. And in doing so, the argument goes that the United States risks providing an opening for countries like China or Russia to fill the gap and thereby draw U.S. security partners into competing spheres of influence. I think many of us in this virtual room will be familiar with how this argument has repeatedly been used to help justify sustaining U.S. security cooperation with partners that are engaged in behaviors that either are contrary to U.S. interests or anathema to the values the United States purports to defend. Time and time again, I think this argument has proven remarkably effective in convincing key stakeholders, including those in Congress, of the necessity to keep U.S. arms flowing, even when the tactical or strategic benefits are questionable, of questionable merit. Moreover, I think this "if we don't sell" argument takes on an even more power in the context of growing geopolitical competition. With the specter, I think, of great power conflict that raises the perceived stakes of near-peer rivalries, one can imagine how a desire to prevent China or Russia from encroaching on U.S. spheres of influence could encourage even more value or severe value compromises for the sake of preserving security partnerships and the leverage that they supposedly generate. But for many of us, it's been a persistent source of frustration that the premise behind "if we don't sell" has been so effective in rationalizing U.S. arms transfers to human rights abusers, authoritarian governments, or states that are engaged in predatory behaviors. There's really a reason to believe that the "if we don't sell" argument is obscuring a far more complex set of factors and considerations that really shape a country's decision to turn to alternative defense suppliers. And it's why I'm so excited to be able to introduce some new exploratory research that my team has been working on that really takes a critical look at some of the foundational assumptions in the "if we don't sell" argument. Our new issue brief, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, highlights how misconceptions about arms dependence may actually be skewing assessments of risks and rewards and decisions to curtail or condition defense transfers to particular partners, and how such realities reflect on concepts of influence and leverage in the security cooperation enterprise. I think this brief couldn't come at a more important or relevant time, just a few weeks after the publication of the Biden administration's new conventional arms transfer policy, and particularly given the policy's explicit commitments to restraint it will be essential to develop greater evidence-based understandings of how partners are likely to react to changes in their arms relationships with the United States. So we really hope that this research is not only informative and interesting, but it really is a useful contribution in that direction. We are very fortunate this morning to have an exceptional group of experts to discuss these issues. In just a few moments, we'll be joined by Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs of California's 51st Congressional District. Congresswoman Jacobs sits on the House Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committees and has a rich history of working on issues related to U.S. foreign policy, international affairs, and conflict resolution. Before joining the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Jacobs served in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the U.S. Department of State, where she focused on conflict prevention and response, countering and preventing violent extremism, and U.S. foreign policy in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm also very pleased to introduce the author of our new brief, my colleague Elias Yusuf. Elias is a research analyst with our Conventional Defense Program, where he works on assessing the broader consequences of U.S. security cooperation and assistance programs. Elias was previously the deputy director of the Security Assistance Monitor and a research officer at Crisis Action, an international human rights organization. And last, but certainly not least, we're joined by Annie Scheel, who is the U.S. Advocacy Director for the Center for Civilians in Conflict, where she leads the organization's work in engaging with U.S. policymakers, lawmakers, and advocates to improve the protection of civilians in conflict. Annie previously worked as a research program manager at Stanford University and also spent 3 years at the State Department, where she worked on human rights, civilian protection, and security sector reform as a founding member of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Office on Security and Human Rights. And on a personal note, I'm extremely grateful for our continued partnership with Civic on this issue and so many others related to a more responsible, transparent, and accountable arms trade. So before I hand it over to our speakers, just a couple of housekeeping notes. This is a public on-the-record event. It is being recorded. The recording will be available later for viewing and sharing with your colleagues. So if you have to miss something, don't worry, you can come back and watch it. We really want this event to be interactive as much as we can have online interaction. And so we want to engage you in the conversation. Our speakers will provide some brief opening remarks, but we encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll do my best to pose them to our speakers throughout the discussion. With that, let me turn it over to Elias to give us a overview of our new policy brief.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be able to discuss some of this new research with such a great group of co-panelists. And, you know, I think the reason why this topic has generated so much interest and why we have such an impressive audience and group of speakers today is in part because, just as Rachel said, the "if we don't sell" premise is very familiar in Washington and beyond. Now, obviously, the exact verbiage of the sentiment has been dressed up in all different kinds of ways, but at its core, the axiom captures this pivotal concept that has shaped the U.S. approach to security cooperation for decades, that if the United States is too constrained in its arms transfers, the door is effectively left open for other countries to supplant the United States as the security partner of choice, drawing countries into the orbits of potentially adversarial governments and eroding what is thought of as this key instrument of American global influence. And as Rachel said, the argument is generally accepted at face value in many cases, especially by some important decision makers. And it can be easy to see why. There is this certain linear logic to the idea. In the marketplace of arms, if one provider is raising the price or refusing to sell, why wouldn't countries turn elsewhere? But as our brief lays out, the reality is far more complex than the old axiom implies. And certainly countries can and have switch defense partners as a way to try to diversify their arms supply networks and for a host of other reasons. But those decisions come with clear financial, tactical, and strategic costs that in some cases may be prohibitive and always have to be weighed against any potential benefit. So on like the most practical level, sourcing and integrating an alternative system or capability can be very challenging. Not all systems are created equal, as I'm sure the US government would argue. And as the sophistication of a platform grows, the number of providers that are producing it is likely to shrink, as is the likelihood that it can be produced domestically. And in those cases, there are going to be other barriers that arise. Ideological or geopolitical alignments may raise additional stumbling blocks. India, for example, is unlikely to source its defense needs from China or Poland from Russia. In one of the case studies that we examine in the brief, we see how U.S. arms suspensions to Pakistan during the Cold War did not lead Islamabad to turn to the only comparable provider in terms of sophistication, the Soviet Union, in part because of the distinct geopolitical bifurcation of the international order at the time. And while Pakistan did import a substantial amount of arms from China at the time, it was overwhelmingly small arms and light weapons and less of those sophisticated advanced platforms. And even if systems can be acquired, if they're available somewhere in the marketplace, integrating them is no small feat. In many cases, American security partners have made decades worth of investments in the logistical, sustainment, maintenance, training, and even doctrinal infrastructure to support US-made platforms. To integrate alternative systems, especially those made by US adversaries, would require costly adaptations or the development of parallel infrastructure that creates readiness challenges and adds financial and logistical burdens for the importer. Consider Turkey, after it was essentially ejected from the Joint Strike Fighter program, as opposed to sourcing a fifth-generation aircraft somewhere else, it just doubled down on the demand for American F-16s, in part because the infrastructure for that capability is so robust and so much of their defense systems are oriented towards NATO standard platforms. And let's not forget the transitions can be very expensive, financially speaking, especially for security partners, the many dozens that have become accustomed to US security sector assistance. For many countries, years of US military aid have contributed to the development of defense sectors that can really only be sustained through financial assistance. Other suppliers might not be willing to offer the same sort of financing, and any transition might jeopardize Washington's largesse in a way that poses a distinct threat to the sustainability of that defense sector. But beyond the practical costs, there are clearly strategic costs as well. Not only does transitioning away from the United States risk efforts to develop greater interoperability with the world's most advanced military, which is often very important to a lot of these partners, it also undermines the broader signal of US support and backing that arms are often understood to connote. And that is an important risk that countries take when they try to integrate new systems. But besides the barriers to or costs associated with adopting alternative security partnerships, I think if we don't sell and the concepts that it embodies points to some deeper issues in US security cooperation. In the first place, it seems to me that if we don't sell a country arms, somebody else will, is generally at odds with another defining security cooperation concept, and that is that arms are a key source of US influence. If a partner can so easily transition from one defense supplier to another, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense that they would accept any conditions or adopt any policies they might not otherwise have for the sake of preserving any particular security partnerships. In other words, for arms to generate meaningful influence for the United States, there must be some degree of cost associated with transitioning to a new supplier. But perhaps more importantly, I think in my mind, if we don't sell and the concepts around it betrays a certain superficiality in some of America's defense partnerships. If the imposition of conditions or any moderation of transfers are all that it takes for a partner to turn not just to another supplier, but to a US adversary and drift into their orbits, it suggests that these partnerships are foundationally weak to begin with. Rather than being rooted in shared interests, ideologies, strategic visions, the if we don't sell concept points to a far more transactional approach to security cooperation that seems unlikely to build the sort of durable partnerships that the United States has so frequently insisted are one of its greatest strategic assets. So taken together, it's easy to see how if we don't sell has distorted some of the arms transfer decision-making process, both by inflating the supposed risks of conditions or curtailments, or by entirely sidelining any discussion of the possible rewards the US might realize from greater discretion in its arms transfers. I think instead, this far more fear-based approach inclines the United States to make persistent sacrifices of values and interests for security partnerships that in some cases, or in many cases, seem to deliver very few returns for the American people. And so with that in mind, what I hope this brief does is spark some more discussion about the ways in which we assess risk, rewards, and strategic value of US security cooperation partnerships. Clearly, there is a lot that remains unanswered, and as the brief acknowledges, there's a lot of nuance to when and why countries elect to turn to alternative providers. I think it'd be very exciting to continue this research and see what else we can discover there. But as many of us can attest to, the "if we don't sell" argument has too often been wielded with very little precision, in an almost sledgehammer-like fashion to preempt some of those more critical conversations. And so what I think this brief encourages is just that, a more nuanced and analytically thoughtful approach that I believe, or I hope, has the potential to maximize the returns for U.S. security cooperation while also assuring that we don't engage in behaviors that come at the expense of good governance, human rights, civilian protection, and other imperatives that we are increasingly understanding are fundamental to U.S. interests. And at a time when the Biden administration is describing an era of competition as one between democracies and autocracies, it seems more important than ever that we ensure that our arms and our arms trade policies reflect that strategic vision for the United States. I'm going to pause there, Rachel, and hand back over, but there's certainly a lot more that we can get into in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Elias. I think it is a brief, so it is not very long, but I think there's a lot of detail and meat sort of on the bone there for people to read. If you can't read the entire brief, there is an op-ed today in Defense One that I highly encourage you to take a look at. It sort of summarizes the whole brief in, I think, about 800 words. And so that may be a good introduction, but I encourage you to sort of dive into the brief a little bit just to understand some of these trade-offs that we have heard mentioned so many times, and the sort of lack of evidence to prop those rationales up. Annie, I want to turn to you now to sort of pull on a thread that Elias mentioned, and that is of civilian protection. And for you to sort of share some of your thoughts about how this argument has been used to the detriment sort of people around the world.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much, Rachel and Elias, for hosting us and for this really useful brief. And of course, a big thank you to Congresswoman Jacobs, who you all will hear from momentarily, for joining us. I do want to make sure to also take a moment to say thank you and recognize your tireless work on civilian harm oversight and legislation in Congress, including founding the Protection of Civilians in Conflict Caucus. So big thank you to that, and really happy to have you joining us. And on that note, one of the reasons I'm excited about this brief and this discussion is because of the bearing that it has on civilian protection and on human rights when it comes to U.S. arms sales. So our organization, Center for Civilians in Conflict, advocates for more restraint in U.S. arms sales and for better policies to ensure that U.S. weapons are not contributing to or facilitating civilian harm or human rights violations. And in the course of that work, I hear this argument in some shape or form constantly, that even in the face of obvious risk that it facilitate abuses, losing that sale is framed as an even bigger risk because a partner might turn to China or Russia. And it's something that, as you mentioned, Elias, is so often taken at face value without further interrogation, which is why I'm so glad to see this work from Stimson really questioning that premise. And I think that there are two questions we need to understand and answer. The first is, how big of a risk is this actually? And the second is, and even more importantly in my mind, does it matter if it is? And I think Elias did a really fantastic job of laying out some clues to that first question, right? And showing that, in fact, there are many reasons to believe that it is not so simple that this is undeniably going to happen. But then we also have the second question, does it matter? Is it a good foreign policy decision to let that possibility guide arms transfer decisions? Obviously, my answer to that question is no. Right? Arms sales are not simply a financial transaction wherein companies compete with each other for buyers. They are an inherently political foreign policy decision that comes with serious risks. Risks like providing the bomb for an airstrike on a school bus in Yemen that leaves dozens of children dead, or sending a political signal of support for systematic human rights violations, or losing track of US weapons, which then go on to fuel conflict and abuses by state and non-state groups alike. So first and foremost, it is not moral nor strategic to engage in essentially a race to the bottom with other arms exporters and to continue US complicity in undeniable harm. On the contrary, I would say that this argument really risks perpetuating a very short-sighted Cold War mentality, whereby, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And in order to keep them on my side, I need to overlook not only human rights abuses and civilian harm, but also often very basic and long-term misalignments in interests and objectives. And of course, we still see that legacy from similar decisions the US made during the Cold War, right? The US made the decision to enable devastating and systemic human rights violations, including through security assistance in many countries around the world, in the interests of what they saw as short-term security, and have left not only a legacy of impunity and trauma, but also predatory governance and instability that continues to have ripple effects globally. I also want to pick up on a point that Elias made about this supposition that losing a potential sale to China or Russia somehow loses the US, not just the sale itself, but also political leverage or influence. And that is, I think, a really tenuous proposition, because as you mentioned, Elias, the very fear that an arms recipient will suddenly turn its back on the US at the first suggestion of red tape or a human rights restriction suggests, in fact, very little political influence on that government in the first place. So I think that's another assumption that requires significant interrogation, this idea that an arms relationship actually gives the US significant political influence, because it doesn't hold up well, right? When arms deals are the face of US foreign policy in a country, when they are the primary tool that policymakers are reaching for to build a relationship, rather than investments in real diplomacy, which actually involves hard conversations, that is a weak relationship. And I think you can take the case of Saudi Arabia, right, which we know has been an enormous purchaser of US arms. Have those sales garnered influence over Saudi Arabia's behavior? Recent experiences would say no, they absolutely have not. And in fact, I would point to current bipartisan efforts in the Senate today via a 502B resolution to demand a reevaluation of the US-Saudi relationship in light of human rights concerns as evidence of that reality. And so what that means is that when US policymakers succumb to this fear, right, that if we don't sell, someone else will, they are not just, in President Biden's own words, checking their values at the door to sell arms, but they're actually doing so without even what they say are the benefits of that compromise. I will say in closing that I am glad that the Biden administration seems to agree with that, in the sense that, as Rachel noted at the top, the new conventional arms transfer policy significantly elevates the importance of human rights and civilian protection in arms transfer decisions. And in fact, at a Stimson event just a few weeks ago, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Lamont said, and I quote, "It is not in the US national interest to race China or Russia to the bottom. It is not in the US national interest to engage in arms transfers where we assess that they are likely to be used in human rights violations." And so I do hope that this, despite the prevalence of this really insidious "if we don't sell" argument, that we will in fact see the cap policy implemented in a way that does not succumb to this flawed idea and instead does engender more restraint and respect for human rights and civilian protection in arms sales decisions. So I will leave it there, but thank you so much for having me and really looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Annie. And I do want to recommend, if you weren't able to tune in for our event 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, I guess now, with both Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Lamont, but also Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Mira Resnick, to really unpack what's in the new Biden conventional arms transfer policy. I encourage you to do so, because I think, we may be seeing a new era of a U.S. approach to arms sales, at least if the cap policy is implemented in the way that it is intended. It is now my extreme pleasure to welcome Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs to our virtual stage. And as Annie said, to really thank you for your tireless work on these issues. And now, as a member of Congress, you have a different role to play than you have in your previous life. And so I welcome your comments on sort of this axiom and how you see it playing out in Congress. So thank you again for joining us, Congresswoman.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and to all three of you, thank you for all of the amazing work you're doing on this and making sure that we are staying true to our values. I will be honest, I was very impressed with the report, and I think it couldn't come at a more important time. We are seeing now the United States focusing everything really in this strategic competition lens with strategic competition with the PRC and efforts to, quote, contain Russia on the world stage. And as Annie said, I think the lessons from the Cold War are super important for this, right? When our support for authoritarian actors for the purpose of short-term alignment or for the sake of gaining or maintaining influence had incredibly harmful impacts all over the global South. And we're still seeing the effects of that. So whether it was Chad or Angola or the DRC, US efforts to counter the Soviet Union and its proxies not only led to democratic backsliding and violence, but it left those populations deeply suspicious of US ambitions on the continent to this day. And in fact, a 2018 RAND study found that US security assistance in Africa during the Cold War increased civil wars and insurgencies because of this exact dynamic. And so this report makes clear that this mindset of if we don't sell, someone else will, doesn't actually even make sense in terms of how decisions about arms are actually made. So as you all have eloquently described, decisions to transition to another arms supplier depends on so many things: ideological alignments, interoperability, cost of adopting and sustaining new systems, readiness, financial means. And the PRC or Russia don't necessarily have the exact weapon systems a country might be looking to replace. And the country looking to replace may not have the means to make that kind of change. And, I think a key piece of this is that the United States often has more leverage than it's willing to use. I think we often feel like we are beholden to countries we're working in instead of recognizing that we actually hold a lot of the power. And I think you see that in, Congress's approach, where, to be honest, we're very inconsistent. Sometimes we have fairly strong congressional signals, for instance, on offensive arms to Saudi Arabia or to Turkey. I think it may not be a coincidence that the weapons both countries are seeking are not easily replicated by another partner. On the other hand, my experience pushing for stronger consideration of human rights and accountability in our security assistance always runs into this question with my colleagues. If we don't provide weapons and other training support in the Sahel, aren't we just ceding the ground to Wagner? Won't their human rights be worse if they go with PRC or Russia, because at least we include human rights training when we're providing the weapons? And my response to that question so far has been, one, we shouldn't be, as Andy said, in a race to the bottom. In other words, we shouldn't be fighting with Russia over which autocratic state to arm, because arming those states only fuels instability, which isn't going to suddenly be strategic because Russia wants to oversee increasing violence in a given country, as we've seen in Mali and the Central African Republic. And two, countries who may be or are currently seeking assistance from Wagner are likely seeking different kinds of support for different reasons that the United States isn't in a position to provide anyway. So we're not going to work on propping up the current regime rather than actually providing effective counterterrorism assistance, for instance. And as we all know, if you want to get anything done in Congress right now, say that it's to counter the PRC. And so the suggestion that PRC may exert influence over a specific country if we don't sell them certain security assistance is very compelling to many of my colleagues. If there's a risk PRC might fill the void in a country, then members are much more willing to look past human rights abuses. But I think moving forward, we need to be clear-eyed about what our strategic long-term goals are in these countries. If the goal is stability or long-term partnership or democracy, then oftentimes these investments are not going to meet those goals. And this may seem obvious, but I actually find it's important to state it. We should be doing what is in the United States' best interest, not just chasing down everything Russia or the PRC is trying to do in every country. Because our real power, the United States' real power, comes from our ability to build international coalitions that further its goals. We've seen that in Ukraine and so many other places. And the key to being able to build those coalitions, the key to that leverage, is maintaining America's reputation as a defender of democracy and human rights, which is one of our main comparative advantages over the PRC. Not to mention, many of these countries have really young populations who are going to remember what we do or do not do with governments that, frankly, many of them don't support. So empowering abusive governments undermines our credibility and harms our national security, and it weakens our ability to maintain partnerships, and it creates blowback. So that's why I continue to prioritize strategic provision of security assistance, and I'm working on introducing further legislation on this issue this Congress. Last Congress, we worked on closing loopholes in Leahy laws that have enabled our security assistance to support foreign partners who have committed human rights abuses. I think a key thing here is making sure we guarantee that human rights vetting applies universally and that we're not simply paying lip service to human rights, but actually ensuring that our commitment is reflected in everything we do. And we also need to connect our security assistance with progress on security sector reforms, which are often just as important, if not more, than a specific weapon to ensure security for populations. And we've seen that with the number of coups, for instance, in some countries that we've been providing security assistance to. So I'll close by saying that as one of the youngest members of Congress, my generation grew up in the shadow of war, and I represent San Diego, the largest military community in the country who disproportionately paid the human cost of war. So our actions today have long-term, far-reaching consequences that can bolster or weaken our own national security, that can create more stability and prosperity around the world or more conflict. And Congress needs to grapple with these dilemmas and understand the trade-offs as we address these foreign policy and national security challenges. So thank you all again so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Congresswoman Jacobs. It's really inspiring to hear sort of not only your passion come through, but really your common sense approach to these issues, right? This is not, when you sort of lay it out in the way that you did, this isn't that complicated. Like, we should be making policies and decisions that are in the US interest, first and foremost, and that are consistent with US values. I wonder if you could share with us sort of how your colleagues on the Hill who sit on the other side of this issue sort of react to some of the points that you have made here today.
Yeah, look, I think I often hear a lot that we need to stay engaged, we need to maintain a foothold to counter Russia or PRC or prevent governments from switching partnerships. I think there's a lot of fear about what kinds of footholds those countries might be able to gain, especially on the African continent, and what that might mean for our national security. And look, there are real trade-offs, right? We do need to decide what is in our national interest. If there's an area where it's more important that we keep a relationship, or it's more important that we're focusing on some of these issues, but we need to be talking about those trade-offs. It's not to say there's a one-size-fits-all approach for every partner country. The other response I often receive is like, yeah, but actually this assistance that we're providing enables US counterterrorism operations, and it's helping us get the bad guys. And frankly, it's not just from the other side of the aisle, unfortunately. We often hear from the State Department in this administration that we need to maintain a relationship. A lot of focus on this idea of maintaining a relationship, but almost for maintaining a relationship's sake, not for any overarching strategic goal or what we're trying to actually achieve in that country or why we need the relationship. And so I think it makes sense in a way, right? Our embassy's job is to maintain official relationships with their counterparts. That's understandable. Our DoD's job in those countries is to maintain relationships with their counterparts. But that's why we need a layer here in DC to think about it more strategically and coherently, so that our foreign policy is not just maintain relationships for maintaining relationships' sake.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think that's a really important distinction. This isn't necessarily a partisan issue, right? It's really sort of a worldview issue, and how you sort of weigh the different values that we're looking at. You mentioned the State Department, you mentioned the administration. I wonder, I know it's very soon after, we're less than a month since the new conventional arms transfer policy has been released, but I wonder if you can sort of look back, and maybe as you're looking forward, how has the State Department or the US government in general reacted to some of these congressional efforts to encourage or limit encourage restraint and limit particular weapons that are going to particular partners?
First of all, I look forward to seeing the implementation of the CAT. We haven't, to my knowledge, gotten notification since the CAT has been released of new arms transfers. So it's, we're still waiting to see exactly what it's going to do. But I will say, we hear a lot of consternation from our partners in the executive branch about, quote, how long security assistance takes, referencing the fact that there are some congressional holds on some things that many of us here in Congress have some concern about providing. So I wouldn't say it's a seamless relationship around these things, but I do think that is important part of the conversation and the separation of powers, honestly. You know, I have had some tough conversations about some of the arms packages that are being proposed. And, you know, sometimes they come and they have some intelligence to share that, you know, actually does change our minds. So, you know, it really is a dialogue on a conversation. And I think it's our role, because of our ability to do those holds, to make sure that they are thinking through these other components.
So I want to encourage our audience to pose questions in the Q&A. I just have a couple more that I would like to pose to our panelists myself, taking the moderator's prerogative. You know, we often hear from government officials or defense sector stakeholders about the risks of limiting arms transfers to certain partners. And we've talked about some of those reasons today. I think we're rarely given the opportunity to talk about what the benefits are to the United States from seeking more discretion in its security cooperation. So I wonder if all of you could help us think through what are the potential dividends we might see from greater arms sales conditionality or restraint. And I'll just open that. Maybe Elias, you can start.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think that there are a few different ways that you can think about the potential benefits from just exercising greater discretion. I think the most obvious one is one that both Annie and Congresswoman Jacobs spoke about, which is just disassociating from the abusive or predatory behavior or dangerous behavior of certain countries. I think there's invariably reputational benefits that you will accrue from that. And that's really important, especially as Congresswoman Jacobs said, in cases where governments are really at odds with their citizens. And instead of just always thinking about partnering with a government, which may be abusive, authoritarian, thinking about partnering with people, I think is really important. So there's that soft power benefit. The second, I think, is there's an opportunity for Washington to use arms transfers, suspensions, curtailments, what have you, as a real powerful demonstration of the credibility and commitment to its interests and values. I think the United States has so many security partners all over the world, and rarely do we take any decisions to meaningfully adjust, at least in any public fashion, arms transfers in light of troubling behavior. So we've essentially conditioned our security partners not to take our conditions, our demands, or the implicit requirements that we attach to our arms transfers very seriously. We've really made U.S. security cooperation and assistance feel like an entitlement. And I think that speaks to what the Congresswoman said, which is that we have more power than we realize in some of these relationships, but we just never, we're so tentative about using it. And I think there's a growing body of evidence, academic evidence, that underscores the need for conditions to be credible if they're going to have any impact on recipient behavior. And I think the knock-on effects beyond the particular partner in question of holding firm to those conditions is that we make a strong signal to our broader set of relationships that we really do mean what we say, and that our considerations are important. It's not this sort of reversing of the power dynamics. Like, we do have a role to play in deciding how our arms are used and what we get for them.
Thanks, Elias. I wonder, Congresswoman, you sort of hinted at this notion of the context of strategic competition, and that there are concerns that by withdrawing security assistance, we're essentially ceding ground to powerful adversaries like Russia and China, and we're allowing them to make critical inroads in important geographies, and we're losing US influence. I'm wondering how you address those concerns and sort of arguments that you use regularly, but that also we can think about in terms of our own policy work.
Yeah, look, I hear this all the time, and I don't want to pretend that there aren't areas that are more strategic than others. I think we need to acknowledge that there are some areas and some countries that are more important and strategically located partners than others. But I also think that we really do ourselves as a country a disservice when we think of security assistance as the only tool in our arsenal. And I think sometimes we forget that there are so many other ways we can engage and partner with countries whether that means simply showing up with a diplomatic presence, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa or the Pacific Islands, increasing trade, engaging with subnational parts of the government that are actually doing good work, that don't have to involve potentially enabling a corrupt or abusive military. And there are ways to actually use the leverage the United States currently has to incentivize the kind of reforms that allow us to partner with militaries. We're looking at a lot of proposals. And, one of the ones that we're still kicking around, but I'm really excited about, is potentially like an MCC-like model for security assistance, where instead of we're talking about you did a bad thing, so we're going to take a security assistance away, it involves a graduated plan where militaries can upgrade the type of military engagement depending on progress that they make, that will ensure our taxpayer dollars are spent responsibly. So I think, sometimes there's very complicated reasons why a government may choose to switch their military partnership that are frankly out of our control. But I think changing our framing and stepping back and having this more nuanced conversation is incredibly important, especially as we're seeing this increased focus on strategic competition.
Thank you. Elias, there's a couple questions in the chat very specific to the issue brief itself. So I'm wondering if you could address why this brief is based on just 2 case studies, Pakistan and Turkey, for those who haven't read it yet, great for those who already have. And so is this sort of this framework more generalizable to other case studies as well?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So first, I'd say that rather than the brief being based on case studies, what we did is we did a theoretical review of some of the factors that contribute to dependency in arms relationships, and applied it to 2 notable case studies where we had a lot of data and sort of a long tail to the relationship, so we could look at it over time. I will say that just as a personal pitch, we are looking to extend this research and look at more case studies and apply some quantitative research as well to see if this holds up. But I think the answer is, some of the factors that we talk about are applicable across the board when it comes to the development of defense dependency. And so, yes, I think that this is largely applicable in a number of cases. And I think another point, we really focus, especially in my remarks just now, on Russia and China. And I think that there was some discussion about, well, how about other providers, maybe not so adversarial, and certainly that is also a component too. But I think that when we're often presented with the argument in policymaking discussions, it really is the boogie monster of Russia and China that is most frequently presented to us. I think there are certainly discussions to be had about when they transition to, let's say, a France or a UK or somewhere else, but the strategic risks that are inherent in that sort of transition are just at a different level in my mind. But still, I think really interesting to apply some future research on those topics too.
Thanks. That's a really good point. And I think it's not only just if we don't sell, the Russias or Chinas or the France and the UKs will jump in, but also if we don't sell a particular weapon system, like a precision guided munition, for example, then others will supply dumb weapons or less tactical weapons. And so that could make it more dangerous for civilians on the ground. And so we should therefore continue to sell the higher tech weapons to particular recipients. I wonder if it's a little bit, it's not if we don't sell at all, it's if we don't sell this, they will pursue that from someone else. So I wonder if you can speak to that as well. Annie, why don't you start?
Yes, I'm happy to jump in on that. So I mentioned earlier the 2018 Saudi bus strike that killed on a school bus, that killed a number of children with a US weapon. That was using a US provided precision munition. And we've seen this all the time. So, the US military, policymakers, industry like to talk a lot about the value of precision. And certainly ensuring that something is not indiscriminate and is able to distinguish between civilians and combatants is critical and is necessary under international law. But precision munitions kill civilians all the time. And look, ultimately, to the base of your question, the conversation we're having is about responsibility. If we have reason to believe that a US arms transfer is going to result in civilian harm, the US has a responsibility not to facilitate that harm, full stop, regardless of what others are going to do. And I know that, that kind of gets at a moral philosophical argument, and those don't always go very far or are seen as very credible in Washington. But that's that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the responsibility the US has. The US is by far the largest provider of weapons worldwide. I think as of last year, now more than the next 4 providers combined. And that comes with enormous responsibility. So.
Thank you. There's a question from our audience that I think is it's interesting to consider, which is, let's say we're right. Let's say we get rid of this premise of if we don't sell, someone else will. Will that lead to the US actually having leverage over particular weapons recipients? Like, what does it mean to get rid of that premise? And would there suddenly be recipients that the US would no longer sell to? Like, if what we say is true, what happens, Congresswoman?
So I would posit the answer is yes. In my experience prior to Congress, I worked with a lot of countries who would hear from the State Department about human rights and know that as long as they partnered with us on counterterrorism, we would kind of turn the other way on the human rights abuses. And now I hear from countries all the time who hear from the State Department on human rights, but know that if they threaten to go with China or they talk about getting Chinese investments, then we'll look the other way on human rights. And so in a way, by being so open about this premise, we are undermining our own leverage, because countries know that at the end of the day, we don't mean what we say on human rights. And as long as they're working with us on whatever the flavor of the day is, whether it was counterterrorism or strategic competition, we will let other things slide.
Rachel, if I can just jump in, I think because the Congressman made some really good points, and I think just on the most practical basis, the acute sensitivity that the United States has had when it comes to putting arms on the table in the discussion about a country's behavior, or discussion of reductions, curtailments, conditions, all of that. I think by and large, many of our partners are fairly convinced that their behaviors are unlikely to really impact their arms relationship with the United States, and we've tended to prove them right over and over again. And so by convincing ourselves that the exercise of our arms relationship to induce a change in behavior risks our reputation as a reliable partner, and risk losing influence, what we end up doing is holding so sacred this theoretical leverage that it really is simply the idea of leverage. It's never really actually put to use, which I think can help explain why we are so consistently disappointed by the supposed influence that leverage is meant to earn us. And so, I just think that we have to maybe dispel with the idea that we are, coveting this leverage such that we don't ever use it. And so I do think, to a degree, if we were a little bit less convinced of the if we don't sell argument, and we're more willing to actually flex that muscle on occasion, we might be more satisfied with the results.
And I will also just jump in really quickly and say, and I think in addition to that really important point, right, of that might result in the US actually using leverage that it has, but also to Congresswoman Jacobs' point earlier, it also might lead to more restraint. And instead of reaching over and over again for this tool of arms sales, right, reaching for other tools that actually do invest in diplomacy, that have longer term benefits, that engender greater respect for human rights and civilian protection and accountability, and stability. And so I think that that's another aspect of it as well.
So I actually wanted to pull on the thread that you mentioned in your remarks, Annie, because it's relevant to the discussion that we're having right now. That you mentioned, arms are seen as the tool in our toolbox that we go to first, right? And that we assume that because we've provided this much sought after commodity, that we will suddenly have this magical influence and we'll be able to change all sorts of behavior. I'm wondering if you all could talk about, if we take arms either off the table or have more conditionality or greater oversight or whatever the alternative is, are there some feasible actions that we can take to work with countries that perhaps are sort of on the cusp of democracy, that maybe don't have the greatest track record, that we want to sort of engage them in positive influence, and not just turning to provision of weapons as sort of the answer to all of their countries' challenges, but particularly in countries with authoritarian governments where we see, both Russia and China's, looming influence, where we see the Wagner Group operating? Are there other things that we can do sort of on a more tactical level than just provide arms?
I can start here. So I think that one of the things that I think a lot about is how narrow our approach tends to be with a lot of these countries. And when there is only this sort of spigot of on and off, or less or more, we really don't have a very diversified portfolio of levers. And of course, the United States does work on other areas, but in many cases, the arms relationship we have with a lot of these countries remains the most central and the most sought after by that government. And it means that we don't have a lot of flexibility to address some of these issues that are really nuanced and tough in the same way that we might want to, or the same way that even other countries have the ability to do. So I think that a few things that both Annie and the Congresswoman said stand out with me. And I think partnering with people is incredibly important, and starting to think about countries as more than just their governments, I think is an important one. But for those countries that are on the cusp, I think security sector reform is a big thing. And then also just investing in some of those diplomatic levers, and not being so reliant just on arms, means that we just have greater flexibility and just a little more acuity when it comes to our diplomacy. But I'll turn over to others.
Yeah, I would just say, I think we underestimate the power our broader investments can have outside of the arms sector, right? A lot of what I hear from my partners in Africa, right, is like, well, we didn't want to take Chinese investment, but America didn't offer us anything, which we can have a whole separate conversation about how I think BRI is a bit overblown. But I do think that we have so many other tools, whether it's trade, whether it's, helping our companies do foreign direct investment, whether it's development assistance, that show a commitment to a country, that help us build a presence there that cost way less than one F-35, and that I think can have similar effects of making sure that we are, investing in these countries and maintaining these relationships and building up the governance that we need, because we know that the governance part of it is actually the key part of making sure these countries become stable. And I would argue that the new, the Global Fragility Act and the new 10-year plan that the Biden administration just released is a big piece of it. And one of the things I'm most excited about that is that security cooperation is supposed to be done in joint formulation with the State Department and USAID as part of these 10-year country plans. And we're going to push to make sure that actually happens. But I think that can be an interesting new model for how we do security cooperation in some of these more challenging countries, because I'm not saying we shouldn't do any security cooperation. We just want to make sure it's in the broader context of our strategies for those countries. And hopefully this can serve as a model for that.
I think that's a really important point, Congresswoman, that there are measures, there are efforts to sort of pivot beyond just a defense relationship. We're in sort of a budget environment right now, and discussions are happening, and there are conversations about the need to cut, particularly on the Republican side, non-defense spending. And so I wonder, how do we pitch to the American public? How do we pitch to members of Congress that we need to increase our spending and our efforts with the State Department and on the sort of diplomatic side at a time when we're trying to counter some of these defense spending pressures?
Well, the sad truth right now about Congress is, if you frame things in countering the PRC, Republicans are more inclined to try and fund it. So part of what we are trying to do is make the case that increasing our international affairs budget per the president's budget that had a 14% increase is actually not just like a nice to have, but actually a key component of making sure we're engaging in strategic competition well. And, a number of retired general flag officers have made the same case. Our DOD folks make the same case. They want to make sure we have embassies in all the countries we should have embassies in, that we have fully staffed State Department, that we have development to bring to bear. Whether we will be able to accomplish that in this current House majority, it's still a bit early to say, but we are working proactively to try and make that case.
Which we appreciate. Thank you. There's a question about whether we're a little bit out of tune with what's happening in the world today, and that we're talking about restraint. We're talking about leverage and influence at a time where we see our own defense sector really suffering from the lack of ability to fulfill the needs of our own defense industrial base. And the sector has been pressured not only by COVID shortages and supply chain challenges, but now the war in Ukraine, and there are orders that can't be filled. And so there's a lot of pressure on the defense industry at the moment. And so are we sort of out of touch with what is happening in the world and the need to maintain the present level of sales or even increase them to maintain sort of a production baseline to make sure that we're prepared for a continuing war, not only in Ukraine, but wherever else a war could occur. So is this the appropriate time to be having this conversation? Are we out of touch with what's really happening in the world? I mean, obviously, I don't think so, but I'm wondering what you all think about that.
Yeah, and I'm going to have to go vote soon, so I'm going to go first in case I have to sneak away. I actually think this is the key time to be talking about this as we are looking at our defense industrial base. So I sit on both the Armed Services and the Foreign Affairs committees. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the defense industrial base these days. And I think there's a few key pieces to this. So the first is that we've been doing these arms transfers and our defense industrial base is not up to the task. So the argument that just continuing to do what we have been doing is going to produce a different result, I think, is a little misguided. The second is, it's undoubtedly true that more orders, that more predictable orders over multi-years helps bring each unit cost down if they're the same unit. But the thing is, we often have an exportable and a non-exportable version of things. So I think we should be having a whole nother conversation about how we build exportability in further up so that we can transfer things to our partners who we should be transferring them to much easier. But it's not exactly one-to-one that if we, the F-35 we let some countries buy, it's not the same F-35 we're building for ourselves, right? There are different types. And the third thing I will say is that I think we overestimate the demand signal part of the defense industrial base because there are years-long wait lists for a Patriot system, for instance. So if it was just about a demand signal, it would not take 6 years for countries to get a Patriot when there are they have the demand, they have the multi-year contracts, and we still can't produce enough of them, right? So I think it's a broader problem than just making sure there's a demand signal. Now, I do think we should, and I think AUKUS is actually going to be a really interesting way of looking at this, right? Partnering with the Australians and the UK to change the way we're doing, the submarine defense industrial base. I think it makes sense to work with our partners and allies that we want to work with on how we share and do create this more predictable and do make sure we're keeping certain lines hot for things like ammunition and other things that we know we're going to need, but that aren't that sexy for the defense contractors to build. But that's different than saying so we should give some country with an autocratic regime the ability to buy a high-end F-35 because it's not even going to be the same F-35 that we're building for ourselves.
Thank you. And I know, Congresswoman, that you do have to go, and I really appreciate you giving us so much of your time and also so much of your work towards sort of a more accountable and transparent and responsible arms trade that reflects U.S. interests and values. So thank you again for all of your service to this issue and, of course, to the country. I wonder if Elias and Annie, as the Congresswoman leaves, if you could talk about how this argument is applied to other sort of regimes or capabilities. So we don't want to lose U.S. defense industry capability or the enhancement of a partner's capabilities by sort of encouraging restraint. So those are also arguments that haven't really been fleshed out or interrogated using Annie's words, right? We just sort of hear like, oh, if we don't sell it, this country is going to be at risk because they're going to lose this capability. Has anything been done to really see if those arguments are viable or hold any weight?
So I think it's another area of great research, but I think it still leans on one of the premises that comes up in the brief, which is that, if that is all that this country is, if it's simply a matter of capability, and we aren't clearly aligned in our interests and our values and a number of other things, I think it's worth asking how intelligent it is to be improving the military wherewithal of that particular partner. If it is sort of this, if we don't sell, then we lose this partner. Now, I think that if it is truly just about the unique capability and we aren't talking about the strips into influence, I think that there's useful discussions that can be had about what needs need to be met on the US side to allow for that sort of transfer. But if we aren't sort of meeting in the middle there, I'm not so convinced by that argument. I'm curious to see if Annie has any thoughts though.
Yeah, I think, one thing I would point to there is, the enormous weaknesses of current US monitoring and evaluation policies, if and where they even exist. So we actually have, by and large, a very, very little understanding of the impact of security assistance programs, of security cooperation, of arms sales, and actually, are they meeting the objectives that the US has set out? And I will not speak to the objectives themselves, which are not my issue. But yeah, I think that is a big piece of it, right? So, many have heard me speak about this on the arms sales side in particular, and use monitoring does not actually exist for use. So the US government has very little information and does not seek out often information about how US weapons are actually being used. Are they being used in human rights violations? Are they being used in IHL violations? What other uses? So that is a huge gap currently. But also to Eliza's point about capability. When it comes to training programs, other forms of security cooperation, we really don't have a good sense of the short and long-term impacts of US security cooperation. And are they meeting the goals that are set out? What are the other trade-offs or unintended consequences that we may be seeing of those kinds of activities? So if the question is about meeting capability, that is a necessary component of that as well.
So there's a question about whether the United States is alone in using this logic of if we don't sell. Do we think that Russia and China or other countries are also saying if we don't sell, someone else will in sort of their arms transfer decisions? Or is this really unique to sort of the US approach to the arms trade?
Just to start, I think that it's important to remember that the United States makes up something like 40% of the global arms market. So we just have a lot more to think about in some ways. But I think it's somewhere that I think would deserve some more research is how do other countries think about their own interests in the context of their arms transfers? And my sense is that in some cases, I view that other countries are less willing, especially some of these other, the Russias and Chinas, that were less willing to accept behaviors that are contrary to their interests than the US is sort of willing to accept. And I just want to flip the question a little bit and just add this other bit here that when the United States thinks about if we don't sell and countries like Russia and China, something that I've found consistently surprising is how much more effective we assume our adversaries to be in translating arms into influence. I think that many of the discussions that I've been a part of, I'm sure the ones that Annie has been a part of, where we've been trying to convince stakeholders of the wisdom of reconsidering arms transfers, the argument that Russia or China will use the opportunity to capture the loyalty of an important government has always assumed the maximum benefit to the U.S. adversary. But the United States knows better than anybody how difficult it is to manage security partnerships, or how frustrating it can be to extract concessions or diplomatic arrangements, what have you. And so given all that, it seems strange to me that we'd sue Russia or China would fare so much better. And so, it's hard to say at this moment without more research what the outcomes for China or Russia are, but I imagine that they would face some of the very similar conundrums that we face. And so I think that scare tactic that we have for ourselves needs to be reconsidered. It's a great question.
Well, I wonder, Elias, if we can sort of pull on that thread a little bit. We've just done some initial research, and obviously the brief has many questions that still need to be answered, and hopefully we'll be able to resource additional research on that. But I wonder if we're talking about arms being this key arena for influence and influence competition between us and the US and its adversaries. How do you think we should be thinking about arms and influence going forward? Are there specific things we need to be looking at?
Yeah, I think that, far too frequently we find ourselves, we end up convincing ourselves that with governments with whom we have very different interests, views, perspectives, very divergent interests, that we can induce them to make these choices through arms. And that just to me seems very unlikely. Unless you have at least some synergy between the perspectives and views and interests of countries, it's unlikely that an arms relationship is going to convince another country to sacrifice its own interests in a really, what can feel like a very substantial way, just to preserve a partnership. So I think that's one of the challenges. And when we have such expansive security cooperation with so many partners, with many of whom we're just not very aligned with, it's helps explain why we've been so frustrated in trying to translate arms into influence. I think a more restrained policy where those partnerships that we're developing are more durable for those reasons that we mentioned, that are based in more bedrock principles, visions, outlooks. I think you'd be more likely to generate the sort of influence, soft power, leverage through arms than you would be with some country that on a whim or just by virtue of some conditionality turns to an adversary for its arms. In those sort of transactional approaches, I just don't think we're going to generate the sort of influence that we're talking about.
So arms are not like other commodities, right? They have different constraints and restraints placed on them, different laws and policies and procedures and regulations for their transfer. It is often very difficult to get information about particular arms transfers, particularly with direct commercial sales. I'm wondering if you both could talk a little bit about transparency and public transparency and how that relates to this arms for influence. If we don't know what is being sent, it's hard to both measure whether it's having the affected or the desired outcome, or if it's been effective in changing a state's behavior or leveraging a state's behavior, but also just really hard to know what's going to particular recipients. So I wonder if you could talk about how transparency fits in all of this.
Annie, do you want to start?
No, Elias, you've done so much incredible work on transparency that I would love for you to start.
Right. So, I think that this goes to the very heart of the issue. Without appropriate levels of transparency, making any assessment, having any public discussion, any debate about this becomes very difficult. And it also becomes a lot easier for governments to sort of say, oh, no, don't worry, the right things are happening. And it becomes very, hard for us to hold individuals accountable, assess the actual quality of our relationships, or provide that role that civil society is meant to provide, which is just this more robust mechanism of study and scrutiny that is meant to improve and course correct US policy. It makes it very easy for people secluded away to make very short-term decisions that may be compromising long-term visions that we have. And I think a lot about, I look at Ukraine right now, and obviously the level of transparency, we always want more. But if you think about how this massive security assistance enterprise in the midst of this very intense conflict has been done more transparently than a lot of our other security partnerships, has allowed a very healthy debate in the United States that in some cases has allowed for greater scrutiny, oversight in a way that maybe makes that relationship healthier. If we can be doing that for a country like Ukraine that is currently at war with a overmatched power. I certainly think we can be doing it in other places, and I hope that that would generate the same sort of healthy debate and scrutiny and discussion that has made the assistance enterprise to Ukraine, I think, more robust and more thoughtful.
Yeah, and I can just add to that. I mean, I completely agree with everything Elias just said. And just in terms of some, specific things, I mean, across the board, so much of the arms transfer process still remains far too opaque, as Elias laid out, which means that Congress, civil society, the American people, people around the world are missing critical information about U.S. weapons being transferred around the world and the impact that they are having. And I think in the chat, there were some good questions about specific things that are missing. But, for example, there's so little information about direct commercial sales, so the sales that are going directly from industry around the world. Very little information about firearms, which have now been transferred to the Commerce Department. As you mentioned, Rachel, those are not a normal commodity that we sell around the world, right? Those are deadly weapons. And so we have very little information about the kind of, due process, the kind of due diligence that goes into those decisions. Probably many sales that don't reach the threshold of notification to Congress. Very little information about when arms are delivered. So there are some weapon systems that the U.S. sells that actually are not delivered for years to come when the political situation or risk may have significantly changed. And then, of course, we have very little information about end-use monitoring programs and what they are finding. We do know that they are not monitoring use, as I mentioned earlier, but beyond that, very little information about what violations are actually found, what accountability comes from those violations, and things like that. So, I mean, there are so many specific things that I think Congress could do to enact more transparency, but of course that the Biden administration could simply decide to do on their own.
And Rachel, if I could just make a couple more points. I think when we say transparency, Annie makes a great point. We don't just mean transparency for me or Annie or you, Rachel. We mean it for Congress as well. In some cases, it is a very few number of people that get to see some of this information, and sometimes it's not reported at all. So our lawmakers often don't have the information they need to help shape policy in the way that they are meant to be shaped, in some cases by statute. The other thing that I'll say is we've seen a number of instances over the last few years where public reporting on security assistance and cooperation has been instrumental in right-sizing the role that arms have in some of our relationships. I think a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the congressional action we saw around Saudi Arabia and the UAE was because much of it was public, but a lot of it isn't. As Annie said, direct commercial sales, we don't see those. And there's evidence to suggest it's much more every year than foreign military sales, which is really troubling. And I'll just make one last pitch for myself. Defense Department security cooperation authorities, there is so much opacity around Section 333, building partner capacity, 127 ECHO. I know I'm throwing out a lot of acronyms, but these are DoD-led security assistance authorities that in some ways go to the most fragile states and where there is maybe the most amount of risk. And not being able to see where that's going, I think is really troubling and makes analysis like the one that this brief does really, really difficult.
And there is a follow-up to this discussion, and that is, do we think that the lack of data and frankly the lack of discussion is why Congress is struggling to act? So we have some very informed members of Congress, but sort of the average member of Congress just doesn't have the understanding, the nuance to be able to engage in a dialogue and to take action. Maybe that still wouldn't lead to more successful legislation or oversight, but I'm just sort of curious. And the question is really about, do we think that plays a role in sort of the lack of action in Congress?
Annie will be able to answer this maybe even better than I, but I think that there have been many instances where members of Congress or their offices are asking us questions to try to become more informed, better informed about what's going on, and asking for specific information about process data. And to be honest, that sort of force multiplier effect that civil society is meant to have is really constrained by this opacity and lack of transparency. And so there just isn't a good ecosystem for trying to get a better understanding of this that would inform congressional decision makers. I think the appetite from Congress is there for better information. It's just very difficult to get it out there. And I was very pleased with many elements of the conventional arms transfer policy, but the mention of transparency in the policy was really in reference to our partners and not to ourselves. I hope that we can sort of similarly live up to that level of transparency and dialogue.
So I want to ask a sort of a last question and maybe feed into some of your final thoughts. There's a question about the use of the term American values. And I think we've all of us have said that on the call and sort of being consistent with, okay, Annie has not, with American values. Like if the US continues to sell weapons to human rights abusers, to undemocratic regimes, et cetera, is that actually a pattern of behavior that maybe is a manifestation of American values that is not what we sort of envision as sort of the democratic support for human rights and IHL sort of mantras that we hear regularly? And so, is there a gap between sort of rhetoric and behavior, which is also undermining our ability to influence, as the Congresswoman said, right? It sort of teaches a lesson about where the United States does and doesn't act and what the US does and doesn't support, and it can often result in blowback. So how, when we think about arms sales and the ways in which we want to influence others, our rhetoric obviously comes into play as well. And so as we sort of conclude here, I wonder if, as you're each making your final comments, how do we sort of change? I mean, a lot of this conversation has been about rhetoric, right? It's all about sort of the realization of this rhetoric. How do we think about changing that rhetoric in the years to come? Maybe Elias, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's a great point, and it is true. It is something that I think we consistently fall short of some of the values we purport to defend, and the ones that we consistently use in our policy documents and our national security strategies. We do use a lot of lofty language, and certainly the pattern here has been consistently disappointing for many years. But to sort of try to end on a slightly brighter note, I think that the fact that we continue to use that language, that's a marker in the sand for us. And when we fall short of that, that should be something that we are disappointed by and take into deep consideration. And so in my mind, what I think of when I think about the arms trade is, why is it there's such a gap between the language and the rhetoric we're using and the way that our policy is being implemented and developed? And so if part of this brief is to try to dispel some of the myths that sustain that gap, well, then I hope that's helping to shrink the discrepancy there. And I think, just to, again, self-pitch, there's a lot more research that's worth to be done on some of this. Large-scale data research would be really interesting. Again, an issue brief is just that, it's very brief. So really looking forward to seeing if there are ways that this research can also contribute even more to trying to shrink that gap there.
Yeah, I will jump off of that and say to that, I think it's a really good question. And yes, absolutely. Of course, there has been an enormous gap between US rhetoric and action and decisions specifically when it comes to the arms trade. And it's been endlessly frustrating. As I mentioned earlier in my remarks, at the time, candidate Joe Biden said, the US will not check our values at the door to sell weapons. But over the course of this administration, we have seen concerning arms sales move forward, right? So the cap policy that I think all of us on the call talked about today does not mean anything on paper if it isn't implemented in a way that actually changes how those decisions are made, and in fact does elevate human rights concerns and international humanitarian law concerns and other human security concerns as well. I will also say, to Elias's point, again, just a big thank you to both of you and to Stimson for the work on this. I think it's really valuable, and I really do hope that we can see more of this research in the future, because I think that there is so much out there to interrogate. And this argument, if we don't sell, someone else will, has real power in DC. It has real power on arms sales to the detriment of human lives around the world. And so I really hope to see more of this as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you for being such a great partner on this research in not only Washington, but really around the world. I really want to thank everyone for an incredibly rich conversation. I'm really glad to see that this conversation has generated so much interest. I can't get to all the questions today. I think it's a great indication of how much salience the "if we don't sell" argument has had, not only in our work, but in efforts to right size the role of arms transfers and what they play in US foreign policy. I also, as Annie just said, I think it's a great signal that we do need to continue this research. You know, Elias mentioned this is really an exploratory brief. It's sort of any of us who work on this field, it's the first question we're always asked by journalists, and we felt the need to sort of unpack this initially, but it really did generate additional questions. And so we do hope to expand this work into a larger, sort of more in-depth program and engaging with many of you as we do so. I really want to thank both Elias and Annie and Congresswoman Jacobs for taking time out of your schedules today to join us and to continue to work on this topic. I really learned a lot and from this conversation. I want to keep this conversation going. I hope we as a community can continue this conversation as well. As a reminder, a video of this recording will be available on the Stimson website. You can also find the brief on the event page for this event as well. And so please share that with your friends and with others that you think would find it of particular interest. And please send us your feedback on it and other areas that you would be curious or interested in us to pursue. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you again on this platform soon. Have a great day.